ka pai. To break something as soon as I start, that's fabulous. E kā rakatira mā, ki ka rōpū whakamana, kia kai whakarite o tēnei hui, ki haumie ki ruka i te waka. Ka nui te mihi ki a koutou katoa. Ka nui te aroha ko toi mai nei ki te tautoko te kōrero o tēnei rakatira, o tēnei maraikura, o tēnei wā. Nō reira, kia ora tātou katoa, kua hui hui mai, ki roto i te kaimanaki o te hapu o Dr Ahuriri. Nei rā te mihi. E rere taku manu ki te tihi o Maukatere, rere iho taku manu mā te awa o Rakahuri. Tau ana taku manu ki te whenua o Waitaha ko Dr Ahuriri, te hapu. Whakaruru hau he uriau ki te whenua o te Waipaunamu. He whakatau ki hai kōrero whakamutuka māku. He mōhio no tāku tūpuna, nata nāhira warewaretu. E hoa mā. E ka uri whakatipu e muri nei, koi penei koutou, ata whaitia ka ōraka mai o ētahi kaika, whakaputa mai ana kia koutou, koi penei kia koutou. Nō reira, he mihi mai oha, he aumihi, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā tātou katoa. Kia ora mō tātou. Greetings to you all, from the place I call home. To you, the esteemed listeners who uphold the mana of this important kaupapa, their organisers, friends and haumie, those who come together to bind the waka. I greet your ancestors and you as their descendants. I am humbled to be able to be in your presence under the kaupapa of the day. I greet you with my moka to my side and the words of my tupuna to guide me, who after the sacking of Kaiapōhia left these instructions. To you, my friends and descendants who follow after me, always offer kindness and hospitality to those who come to you deprived of homes, lest this may happen to you. I am here to support the leadership of this wahine, e kare, who has unearthed the narrative shared across oceans and that which reside within our homes, here in Te Waipounamu and Aotearoa. It is a shared legacy, that which disproportionately impacted Indigenous peoples. This legacy of ideas and then policies and hands that made actions to follow, that said the very whānau in which we are grown within was the problem to be severed, to remove the child from that which sustains us as a people. Our dreams across oceans and generations, from Aboriginal mothers who talk of ghosts returning, and children who know what disconnect feels like, to be reunited with home. And home is the people and the places from which we come. The traditions that contribute to a generation, a memory of greatness, of small moments and gestures recognised as whakapapa. The only way not to repeat the legacy of disruption is to hear the voices of those who lived, who still live, who informed Puao Te Atatu, of the various commissions and tribunals who live this. And so I mihi to Annabel and her unique contribution to this necessary speaking back, to this weaving of lived voice and academic rigour, of intellect and heart, and to offering up the solutions that start with honouring the stories that remind us of the legacy we have the opportunity to create. Ka hore e mutika, he mihi kia koe, e hoa. Kia ora mō tātou. Tiria manu, tiria manu, werohia ki te poho te raka, kata irere, kata mai I te ruhi, e tau e koia. Koia, koia, ko tararariki, ki mai maui e hara, I te whitu me te waru e tau e koia. Koia. Kia ora. Au e taukiri. Me pēhea rā te whai I ngā tapu ai o te tuakana rā. Tēnā tātou. Tauti mai, nau mai ki te whare wānanga, kia koutou ngā manuhiri ki tō mātou kāinga, mātou ranga me ki tēnā koutou I tai a tinana mai. Wai hoki kia koutou kāti honoka, kia koutou e hono mai I te ipurangi me ki, tēnā koutou o tira tēnā tātou katoa. Just wanting to greet you all, those of you who have come in person to share in tonight, but also those of you who are joined with us, Kāti Honoka, me ki, you're a new hapu, new iwi, who are joining online and recognising that, you know, the whiunga o te wā, or this time of COVID means that we can't always be in person. So just recognising each and every one of you. And I also said, gosh, how do you follow in the footsteps of that? Pretty awesome. Hopefully just kind of para the huarahi, just get it ready for Annabel, is the mission for me tonight. Tēnā koutou, ko Janine Tāmati ala tōku ingoa, he uri ahau no kaitahu kāti māmoe wai hoki, he uri ahau hoki no te ati awa, no Ngāti Mutunga, no Taranaki Maunga, nā reira tēnā tātou. I'm Janine, I hail from the south actually, from Ōtākau, born and bred, but live here in Ōtautahi, have the pleasure of working with Annabel, have had the pleasure of working with Amber too, and we're cousins, but also I'm just really delighted to be able to welcome you all here. And I have the really exciting job of explaining a few things before we get started, housekeeping, starting with the most important thing, wharepaku. For those of you who are in-house and need to use the bathrooms, they're situated here on the ground floor if you just go out the door to the left and to the right. There is plenty of signage and I'm sure you can follow. Just a reminder too that, you know, welcome to Tauhere UC Connect. This is a lecture series that Te Whare Wānanga o Waitaha o UC offer throughout the year. They're free, they're open to anyone to register and attend, and thank you to those of you who already did register tonight and came along. They're public, and we love having new members to our iwi, even online, Kāti Honoka, joining us, so thank you, and we hope you enjoy the evening. If you hear, for those of you in-house, sorry for those online, but if you do hear the fire alarm, please just follow UC staff instructions. There's a few in the house. We might get to raise hands because we haven't got distinguished T-shirts or anything. I'm one. There's a few up the front here. Put your hands up, ladies, and I know there might be one at the back. We'll just follow our noses too. So please just follow us and follow our instructions, and we'll lead you to the evacuation points. Do remain as a group. He iwi ko tahi tātou kei roto nei. So we're all together in this whare. So just follow us as a group. In the unlikely event of an earthquake, I don't know who wrote that, but we're in Ōtautahi. But in the event of an earthquake, if there might be one, we just ask you to stay where you are until the shaking stopped and just take shelter where it's safe to. Don't evacuate unless you're instructed to by one of our staff members. If evacuation is necessary, there is an assembly point. So once you exit the nigh theatre, so we'll exit out here or out the back there, there is a place at the back of the car park. So again, just follow us and we'll lead you to safety. While you're on the UC campus, for those of you that are going to have to navigate your way back to your cars or your vehicles or even a taxi or a bus,
you can use Te Ara Pourewa o Ngaitahu. We've got 13 UC Help Towers on campus. It is a big campus, but just look for the beautiful lit up signs with some beautiful artwork, and on there will be some instructions on how you can contact UC Security and they can support you getting back to your vehicle if you get lost on campus. As I mentioned, my name is Janine Tamatialif. I'm very lucky to work here at the university. I work for Te Wakapā Kākano, which is the Office of Māori, Pacific and Equity. But more importantly, I'm a good friend of Annabel's as well, and we've known each other for over 20 years, raised our babies, children who are now giants, together. And actually I was very privileged to be able to support her through her PhD process as well. And I may or may not have contributed to her research. I'm a long-time fan. Yes, I fangirl on her, but also I just, for me, just want to acknowledge, the mana wahine that she is, the wahine toa that she is, not just for the university, for research in this kaupapa, but actually for her whānau, as a hell of a hākui, as an amazing mum. So. On that note, I am going to pass over to Annabel, and just to let you know, the format for this evening is Annabel's going to wow us all for the next 35 to 40 minutes. There is a time at the end for questions. All I ask is that it is a question. Apparently, I was like, he Māori aho, we don't really do questions all that well sometimes. We like to make statements, even though it says, please, no statements. There is time at the end for you to ask questions, seek clarity, share a something, and hopefully we do have plenty of time for that. But other than that, I just want to welcome Annabel no Ngāti Kahungunu, no Ngāti Raukawa, no Ngāti Parau ia, ko mōhio ke tia etahi o tātou, he hākui miharo, he kairangahau miharo roake, an amazing researcher, educator and mum, and other things that she stunt doubles at. But I'm going to leave some time for her to talk about her amazingness. Tēnā tātou.
Okay, everyone can hear me okay? Yep. Generally don't have any problems being heard, so. Tēnā kōrua, mō tō kōrua awhi, tautoko me manaaki hoki. Thank you for your support of my mahi and this kaupapa, which sits in a much larger shared kaupapa of seeing our people thrive. I'd also like to express my gratitude for having grown up under the mantle of Aoraki and the manaaki of the Ngaitahu people, the mana whenua of Ngaitua Ahuriri. This Māori adoptee is eternally thankful. So, tēnā koutou katoa, he mihi ana ki a koutou e hui hui mai nei tēnei pō, a kānohi and online. Okay, me tīmata tātou. He taonga te tamaiti. My name is Dr Annabel Ahuriri-Driscoll. I'm a senior lecturer in the School of Health Sciences here at the University of Canterbury. And I'm here today to talk about a topic very important to me, very dear to me, as a researcher, but also as a Māori adoptee. Who should care for our tamariki, our Māori children, and what can we learn from closed adoption in that regard? Okay, so there's no doubt that this is a controversial question, particularly in our current context in which 69% of those in state care identify as Māori. A history of state care is regarded as a risk factor by Oranga Tamariki social workers, adding impetus to the removal of babies. In 2019, 48% of pregnant women whose Māori babies were taken into state custody before birth had been in state custody themselves. So in some whānau, state care and removal is intergenerational. Māori babies are being uplifted by Oranga Tamariki at a disproportionate rate, 5 times the non-Māori rate in 2019. The Māori investigation of the Abuse and Care Royal Commission of Inquiry has recently concluded, in which testimony and evidence was presented regarding the devastating impacts upon state care survivors and their whānau. And now the adoption law reform which is finally turning our attention to the impacts on the unknown but sizable number of Māori children adopted since 1955 under the Adoption Act. The care of children is an emotive issue, and for good reason. The safety and well-being of children is a paramount concern. However, with respect to tamariki, this has not necessarily been ensured by the actions of the state. So, adoption is part of the spectrum of care, a permanent, state-facilitated but private arrangement. By reducing the burden of caring for children in state institutions, adoption was a desirable option. And so the Adoption Act established what's known as a complete break or closed stranger adoption, based on the assumption that a full and final separation of birth mother and child was the best option for all involved. And these clauses, or this clause and these sub-clauses in the Act, sever the legal relationship with birth or biological parents and replace that with a legal relationship with adoptive parents. So the term in there, as if born to, creates what's called a legal fiction, an assertion that is accepted as true for legal purposes, even if it's untrue. And it was then maintained through secrecy, the sealing of birth records, reissuing of a new birth certificate, and also matching, which I'll elaborate on a little bit later, leading it to develop into a general fiction, giving rise to silence. We don't talk about it. Why? You're as if born to. And sometimes denial. So, thinking back to the time though, these actions were responses to the stigma of illegitimacy and infertility. Despite the access allowable following the Adult Adoption Information Act 1985, and even the openness of adoption practice since then, birth families have no legal rights to enforce access to the adopted person, to their tamaiti, to their mokopuna. And so how does the Act apply to Māori? Well, sections 18 and 19 pertain to the adoption of Māori children and the practice of whāngai, respectively. Section 18 makes it clear that anyone who applies, Māori or not, can potentially adopt a Māori child. This section addressed the previous inequity in the law where Māori were not able to adopt Pākehā children, and that had been introduced in 1909. Section 19 prohibits the practice of whāngai or adoption of any child in accordance with Māori custom. And whāngai is fundamentally different from legal adoption, so its definition as a customary form is not particularly accurate. In Māori society, and I'm quoting Animi Kaere here, it was relatively common for children to be given to someone other than their birth parents to be raised, but there was no substitution of parents. The whāngai child remained a child of their whakapapa whānau and had an absolute right to know their whakapapa. Furthermore, there was no expectation that such arrangements had to be permanent. And whāngai was practised for a variety of reasons, including the transmission of mātauranga or tikanga to mokopuna. It was also to cement ties or relationships between whānau and hapu, perhaps even iwi, to provide respite to parents, or to enable those who were childless to become parents. And so practised in all those ways, whāngai served to strengthen whānau and kin connections. But from the perspective of policymakers, whāngai was an integral part of the communalism of Māori society that they sought to dismantle, breaking down the beastly communism of the tribe, which was perceived to stand in the way of the assimilation of Māori, was deliberate and calculated. Officials perceived that whāngai children were more likely to be brought up in conditions of disease, ignorance and poverty, and that there was the potential for child neglect and delinquency as a result of children being without legal status. So from 1909, Māori were required to adopt through the Native Land Court. in order to create the legal relationship between adoptive parents and children, or Whangai parents and children. So there was a clear distrust of Māori whānau and communities to adequately care for their own children. And then as we entered the 1950s and 1960s, the difficulties experienced by Māori whānau and young people adjusting to unfamiliar urban life was apparent, in part due to the increased surveillance from the state and the hostility that greeted them. And so the distrust of Māori traditions with respect to the care of children only grew. And so in a climate of assimilation and integration, the most acceptable way to be Māori was to be detribalised and only retain what Hun, who wrote the infamous Hun report, refers to as a vestigial Māoritanga. And so in that context, the formal adoption of Māori children out of their whānau was not a cause for concern. To our policymakers and decision makers. So the social welfare system oversaw the closed adoption of large numbers of Māori children to non-Māori families. But precisely how many children is not known. Due to haphazard recording of children's Māori ancestry in adoption files, and only according to the half-caste or more quantum, that legal definition of the time, a number of Māori children were not counted as such. We do know that in one year, probably one of the peak years, 1970, 16.4% of children adopted out were Māori. But that does include those that were recorded as a quarter or more degree of Māori blood. And so Māori fathers were overrepresented in that 1970 cohort. Almost 23% of the fathers of children born out of wedlock were Māori, indicating that there were considerably more Māori fathers than would be expected on the basis of Māori representation in the general population. And so that fits the anecdotal evidence that a large number of Māori children adopted out were the products of unions between Māori fathers and Pākehā mothers. I am one of those. And so that meant that the decisions about adoption were more likely to be made by Pākehā families, facilitated by child welfare rather than Māori welfare officers. And there were cases where children of Māori birth fathers were adopted without the father's knowledge, or even against whānau requests that they adopt the child. And so in a society in which the stigma of illegitimacy loomed large, and there were negative and prejudicial attitudes about Māori, the alternative to adoption was unpalatable for many Pākehā families, i.e. for their daughter to marry the Māori father prior to birth. And there were also limited numbers of Māori adopting parents. And so placing Māori or part Māori children was reported as difficult due to Pākehā adopting couples' reservations about adopting a Māori child. And that may not have been due to racial prejudice as such, but perhaps the violation of the matching principle that a visibly Māori baby might mean. And so what's known as matching for marginality then came into effect. And this was the practice of matching for difference, i.e. the placement of different children with adopting couples who were also different or deviated from the norm in some way, or who expressed willingness to accept a different child. And so there's evidence that on this basis, Māori infants were more likely to be placed with less suitable adopters. Decisions in magistrates' courts were more likely to favour strangers or non-kin over elderly or poor Māori grandparents. So the majority of Māori children were adopted by Pākehā families, and then they were enculturated in the Pākehā world and worldview without connections, experiences or understandings to support their identification as Māori. And so this removal of children from their cultural communities in number constituted a significant loss of human capital, I guess if you want to think about it in those terms, and that was described by some later as legalised cultural genocide. I mean, we would probably be very comfortable applying that term to the Australian context, where the policies were much more blatantly pursuing extermination, but our softer form of assimilation here means, I think as a nation, we find it very difficult to think about adoption and other forms of removal in that way. So, on the basis of this analysis of primary and secondary sources, I think we can be justified in considering this large-scale removal no accident, rather the achievement of a deliberate policy objective. And so we moved away from that, though, with, I guess, probably one of the key changes, although preceded by changes in practice, but was the introduction of the Adult Adoption Information Act 1985, and that officially marks the end of the closed adoption period because it enabled the unsealing of birth records for adopted people once they reached the age of 20, under certain conditions, for example, birth parent approval. So where a birth parent might place a veto on a file, you would not be able to access that. So as an adopted person, you know, it's hope. Here's hoping. But prior to that point, from a peak, maybe depicted in that photograph right up the top there, from a peak of the highest number of domestic adoptions per capita in the Western world, so more than 6% of live births in 1970 and 1971 were adoptions. Adoptions had been in decline as the increased availability of contraception meant unplanned pregnancies were less likely. The stigma associated with births out of wedlock lessened, and mothers were hypothetically in a better position to keep their babies with the advent of the domestic purposes benefit. And I say hypothetically because there were cases in which young mothers were not made aware of that entitlement. There was also increased openness in adoptions as the benefits of birth-family contact were recognised by social workers. Also, the review of the social welfare system from a Māori perspective, published in the Puao Te Atatu report of 1988, found closed adoption to be, I'm quoting here, a totally alien concept to Māori, contrary to the laws of nature for its assumption that lineage could be expunged and birth and parental rights irrevocably traded. Although the statement of opposition from Māori came, sort of this official statement of opposition came fairly late in the piece, the report made it very clear that the disconnection of children from their whakapapa was unacceptable. Despite, or perhaps in spite of these challenges and changes to closed adoption practice, the law has remained the same. In some ways, some of these factors may have counted against law reform or any significant attention to the impacts of adoption because it's deemed to be a practice of the past. We don't do it anymore. What's the problem? And it is also much less prevalent than previously. So, what are the impacts of closed adoption for Māori people? My research and that of several other Māori adoptees, and indeed our own experiences, have highlighted the significant and lifelong impacts. And so on the next few slides, we're going to see some quotes from participants relating to those different points. The disconnection resulting from lack of knowledge of whakapapa. So I've put loss of whakapapa there, but there is a whakaaro that you never lose your whakapapa. You have it, you embody it. But if you don't know, what are the consequences of that? If you can't cite that whakapapa, where do you stand? How do people connect to you? How do they know you in the Māori world? The profound sense of differentness that was produced by being adopted. And differentness is a word. It's distinct from difference. The contradictions of being raised as if born to Pākehā parents, while you might have been racialised as not Pākehā. And then the difficulties that this leads to in terms of claiming a Māori identity. And I would argue the fundamental insecurity of being that results. So disconnection from a fundamental aspect of self is one impact, but this is not self in the kind of individualistic Western sense of the word. This is self being part of a collective, being connected and known through those relationships. But my participants talked about the sort of lack of realness resulting from loss of biological origins and therefore whakapapa. Several of my participants likened this to being on the edge of an abyss or a black hole. Not possessing knowledge of whakapapa has complicated their participation in the Māori world. It's complicated their reconnection because Māori can't place or connect to them. So here in the top quote, Rick's saying he's doing some training, he's standing up, has been asked to talk about himself. He says, I couldn't do it. And as I stood up, this black hole opened up behind me and I just wanted to fall into it. It scared the piss out of me. And I just sat back down in tears. And the kuia said, you need to know, you need to go find out who you are. And that was the start of his journey. So he was older than 20, but he realised I really need to do this. Jenny talks about, again, this term, abyss, and none of my participants had talked to each other, so they're using the same kinds of language to convey what that feels like. You're standing on an abyss, on a black abyss, there's nothing behind you. You don't actually know who you are. You could fall into that, disappear, into that blackness, because what's there. And what's really unique about Jenny is that she married another adoptee, and so together they both had all those losses associated with being adopted, and they then were quite resolute, I guess, in their creation of going forward for their whānau together. Donna Marie describes as that an empty hole in that wairua space, so empty. And what wairua is for her is about this deep connection between her and others, a deep, she calls it cultural connection, but as I'm going to talk about later, it's so much more, or we need to reframe how we think of culture. And then lastly, Shane talks about, I guess, what it's like again to be without whakapapa. So what whakapapa does, it's like coordinates. So these are reference points for us. Our tūpuna, talking about navigation, how they do that. And then to be without that, as an adoptee, you have nothing. You're just floating around out in the dark. And yeah, I've heard terms, obviously in the literature, people talk about being a kehua, floating over the top of the ground, no roots. And that was something my participants talked a lot about. There was also an enduring sense of difference arising from physical appearance and knowledge of Māori heritage in a Pākehā family, as well as being adopted in a world that privileges biologically based belonging. And so in many adoptive families in this period, what we'd call race evasiveness or colour blindness was prevalent on the base that if race isn't recognised, there will be no racism. So although Māori adoptees were defined by their race, that would often be denied or minimised, leaving them on their own to navigate or deal with racism. And so this forms one part of the transracial adoption paradox identified by Richard Lee. To describe transracial adoptees' experiences of growing up in a white family and being treated as an honorary white, but being seen by the rest of society as a racial ethnic minority. And when transracial adoptees don't identify or behave in a way deemed consistent with their race or ethnicity, they may be deemed as problematic or flawed or inauthentic. The term plastic comes to mind because of their lack of lived experience within their racial and ethnic communities. And so there are several implications for identity. Transracial adoptees are likely to develop a marginal identity in which they are aware of not being fully accepted by the white community into which they've been adopted, which might in fact denigrate racial or ethnic minority groups. And on the other hand, they are isolated from their racial or ethnic community. And so a quote from the Bringing Them Home Stolen Generations report says, through constant exposure to this conflict, the adopted child inevitably becomes alienated from both cultures. And so just seeing in some of those quotes there, you know, Shane's saying, where do I fit in? You know, we're in Aotearoa, New Zealand in the 1980s. There's, you know, around the time of the Springbok tour, you know, there's a polarisation. What does he do? Is he supposed to take sides? And then towards the end of his quote, he says, you know, he would have loved to have spoken Māori, but always felt inadequate. So without his whakapapa, there was that whakamā, which meant he felt he had no legitimate place to stand for a start. So even though he went to a Māori boys' school, you know, this lack of knowledge, and also, I guess, the fact that his well-meaning Pākehā parents had placed him there, but he was isolated without the supports, really. Jenny says, part of my difficulty, yes, I'm Māori, but I've been brought up white. So this produces, as she calls, this juxtaposition. On one hand, yes, I can pronounce some words, but then I'm not fluent. I don't belong to a marae, so she doesn't know where she comes from, you know, where she might, but which marae she might belong to. So then, approaching marae, she's very uncomfortable. And then there's the expectation, but hey, you're Māori, you're going to know this stuff. And that's an assumption. But she says, actually, she describes herself, I'm a white Māori. But lastly, on a positive note, I mean, Lisa says she kind of makes this work for her. So says, actually, my being between means that I can do some really useful work. I can translate. I can stand in the middle. I can translate ideas and issues for non-Māori. And I can be doing that, some of that bridging work. And as she says at the bottom there, I see myself as stuck in between. I might as well use that. Now, because Māori birth identity and heritage was really erased by the legal fiction of being as if born to non-Māori adoptive parents, this may make registering with iwi difficult or succeeding to land impossible, depending on what's recorded on the original birth certificate. Even if they are able to trace their whānau, adoptees will not necessarily be able to entirely reclaim their biological identity. And so here's Donna Marie's experience of this in terms of being able to succeed to her grandmother's land. And she says because of her adoption, she has no legal relationship to her birth grandmother. And so she's been trying to kind of prove this to the court. But what's most important for her is, you know, being recorded alongside her siblings and in the whakapapa records. That's what matters to her. But she says, you're a stranger. By law, you have no relationship to them. I'm nothing to them on paper. And so unless I can get my name on those land records, because they become a record of whakapapa into the future, I have never existed. Yeah. So my argument is that these losses and challenges are deeply unsettling at a fundamental level, an experience of lessened security of being, resulting from non-acceptance of one's reality or existence. And there's a lot of literature on the kinds of discourses that, I guess, general society sort of responds to adopted people with. Actually, you should be grateful. Hey, you're lucky you were adopted into this loving family. And for a lot of people, that you know, produces a fair amount of anger because it's glossing over the loss. It's this denial of the facts of your existence, your being. So my analysis showed that these are matters of deep personal identity, constraining or affecting the adopted person's positioning, and that extends to the generations that follow. So what can we learn from international research? Because there's some fabulous research being done overseas. Very hard to do adoption research here in Aotearoa, New Zealand. We're just a little bit more closed. And I guess probably larger numbers of international adoptions overseas. There's some very well-established programs. First of all, in terms of transracial adoption, I think owing to our avoidance of race in Aotearoa, we tend to think of Māori primarily in cultural terms. So what our colleague Garrett Cooper calls the culture thesis. It follows that we think of the issues that Māori adoptees face as being confined to the cultural identity domain. And cultural identity is nice to have, but not as important or fundamental as attachment and security. In contrast, as I said, my analysis has shown that adoptee identity challenges are much more fundamental, linked to personal identity and positioning that endures. So, in keeping with the culture thesis, cultural socialisation is seen as the solution to these issues. Cultural socialisation might include a range of strategies where adoptive parents bring aspects of their child's birth culture into everyday life, whether this be in the form of culture camps, as they're known in the US, attendance at ethnically diverse schools, or exposure to particular ethnic contexts, learning aspects of culture and language, perhaps even undertaking heritage or homeland tours. And there's some evidence that those strategies can be beneficial. But Richard Lee's research is clear. Parents must engage in ethnic socialisation. It's not enough to be a good or loving parent. Parents must actively embrace their adopted child's birth culture, making for a more immersive, enriching experience that doesn't other the child. But Lee cautions there's only so much that can be done in a white space. And we know that ethnic socialisation in spaces where the adoptee is not an outsider contributes to healthier identity development. Also, peers are just as important as parents, and that points to the need for adopted children or people to be connected to experiences not only within the adoptive family, but beyond and through others. So that requires parents to be well and authentically networked to the Māori world, in our case. But ethnic or cultural socialisation is insufficient. Racial socialisation is also needed. So adoptive parents ideally would have an understanding of how race and ethnicity shapes their whole family, preparing children for bias, prejudice and discrimination, making those just normal parts of everyday conversations can be protective. But that requires a high level of race consciousness. It may be challenging for dominant culture member parents who have no lived experience of this themselves. Now, openness or sharing of information about biological heritage may be insufficient to grant a child an open identity. There is a difference. Indeed, I'd argue to realise whakapapa in its fullest sense, relationships are required. And also what we know from overseas research is while there are benefits of open communication and contact with birth relatives, such experiences do add complexity to family life. And so infrequent or unpredictable contact can reinforce a child's sense of rejection. But adoptive kin network relationships are complex and interpersonally demanding, and so professional guidance is very useful, but that was certainly not available to adoptive parents in the closed adoption period. So I think I want to say I'm not coming down on adoptive parents here. I'm saying this was a broader state responsibility that because adoption was seen as a private arrangement, wasn't followed through. Also, the last point there is that in Aotearoa, because of the 1955 legislation, openness takes the form of a gentleman's agreement, where any contact is dependent on the adoptive parent's willingness and ability to manage the situation. So this was a case heard in the family court last year, framed as a Māori child losing the benefits of a loving, stable home provided by Pākehā parents over her cultural needs not being met. The possibility of her cultural needs being met in a family more immersed in a Māori community also carried with it the bonus of placement with a sibling. But removal would also cause significant disruption to her, to the attachments she had formed and possibly the benefits to her wellbeing that had resulted. Ultimately, it was ruled that stability and attachments were more critical to maintain, ahead of, as the judge described it, a culture-centred ideology. There are several perspectives that need to be considered here, but this case, I think, highlights the contested significance of culture in the care of Māori children, as well as the difficulty and complexity of care decisions. But I'm arguing that we need to reframe culture and its relative importance as equivalent to safety and a critical part of meeting a child's developmental needs. So finally, what does this mean for law reform and beyond? I think we're right at the beginning of this conversation in many ways, despite this being a third attempt at law reform. The discussion document provided by the Ministry of Justice suggests the merit of articulating a clear purpose for a reformed Adoption Act. So this might be important in enabling an open and frank discussion of the problems that adoption is trying to fix and exposing and challenging some of the implicit motivations. If stability, security and permanence for children are the aspirations, is adoption the best way of ensuring that? Are there other options that might not involve the severing of birth-family relationships and the pretense of as-if born to? Is enduring guardianship sufficient to ensure permanence and stability? With respect to Māori, how can we best support the practice of Whangai and its inherent values of whakapapa and whānau? Might those principles and values also be supported through adoption in a new form, or not? Who ought to decide? What reformed practices of adoption will better uphold te tiriti o Waitangi and its guarantees of rangatiratanga, the protection of taonga, equitable outcomes, and also tikanga, if we're counting Article 4. Does being Māori preclude applicants from adopting a Māori child? When and in what circumstances? Ultimately, I think adoption law reform and the current scrutiny of the care of Māori children is providing us with opportunities to have a much broader conversation, to interrogate our assumptions about what it means to be a parent, how child-centred we really are, and how we conceive of families. So what's the relative importance of biological and social parentage? Does being a parent require an exclusive property right with respect to a child? Are we willing to accept a child's access to identity as being on par with an adult's right to become a parent? I've got lots of questions on this slide. Has it become a truism that Māori children are best raised outside of their whānau? Are we still bound by the thinking of 1950s New Zealand? State knows best, Māori cannot be trusted to raise their own children. Former Children's Commissioner Andrew Beecroft asks, what is our tolerance for the status quo? And I would add, is this greater than our tolerance for the challenging conversations and the change that is required? Nō reira, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā tātou katoa.
According to my fancy iPhone, we still have 10 minutes to fill in. So I hope that you either have all of the answers to those questions, or perhaps I can call on those of you who are here with us tonight if you have any questions. Kaue whakamā, kia kahara. Tēnā koe. Yes.
I am learning the Māori culture, I'm very impressed by the Māori struggle for their power they had. I believe that even and my question is, could you elaborate more about the openness? Because it's admirable for Māori people to fight for their power, but that is the consequence of the decolonization. But nowadays, it seems another pressure, another social issue, alarming one, which is the divisive of the society. they divide to each other. One even support Russia, one support. It seems that many political activists they argue against tribalism. So if you enhance your identity too much, for example, I can myself as an Arab, you are Filipino. So it's already build a war against us, dividing us. You, us, they, us. So you that this new economic situation can impact our.
Yeah, well, I have to say, I mean, look, as an adopted person, answering all these questions can be quite difficult because it is very personal. But, and look, there are lots of adopted people that may not feel the need to know their birth identities either. So I guess I need to be careful not to make generalisations, but I think I draw some strength from some donor-conceived people that I've met recently who are actually very clear, and that's where some of the open identity language comes from. I think that in some ways they're able to be clearer about these issues. I don't know, I think because the discourses around adoption are very sort of silencing. I think many of us feel we cannot speak up. I think maybe when you're a donor-conceived person, the circumstances are slightly different. But those people are saying it is not enough to be open about my origins or how I was conceived. I actually need enough information, and more than that, I need connection to have what everybody else takes for granted. And so I guess, yeah, I think that's my question around when are we going to accept that that is actually a person's right? And it should never be sacrificed. And I think Rebecca Hamilton, who's a donor-conceived person that's written beautifully around this, that says, you know, if you're considering entering into an arrangement to meet your needs that actually, you know, prevents somebody else from meeting their fundamental needs, that's not right. But in your point about the divisiveness of, say, tribalism and identity, I don't know, I don't think that's the problem. I think actually the problem is a society that cannot handle pluralism, that has a very constrained way of thinking about how people identify. I think if you let people identify how they want to, and you're not putting constraints on that, I think that can only be positive. Yeah.
Here's a question.
Kia ora. Kia ora, Gretchen.
Thank you for as you know, I'm Canadian. And at the beginning of your talk, you talked about the whole colonial experience and how it's not just New Zealand or this instance, but something that was a pattern of policy throughout.
Yeah.
And certainly from people's experience, what you described is very similar. In terms of the end of your talk, exploring how we address these issues in a way that's more meaningful and addresses the needs of adoptees. What do you take from this? Whether pieces of information that are useful, that may provide insights?
Yeah, I mean, I think some of Richard Lee's research and sort of his team are enlightening, but I think those points that I think the challenge for us in Aotearoa, as I mentioned, is we're a little bit behind sort of some of the conversations in other countries, in that I don't think we've really been able to talk about race. I don't think we've been able to admit you know, what we as a settler nation have done, that we've actually, you know, we might boast that we think we have the best race relations in the world, but I think it's just we don't talk about a lot of these things. So I think it is much easier when you look at Australia and Canada, you know, the language is different. Yeah, as I mentioned, that language of extermination, I think that makes it easier. I think there's still the denials there, But, you know, we've only had recently the discovery of bodies at the residential schools. So, I mean, we indeed have that history, but it's been much more hidden. So I guess I just feel, as I mentioned, that we're right at the start here. I think Canada's had their Truth and Reconciliation hearings quite some time ago. Our Royal Commission of Inquiry is a start to that. Adopted people are part of that scope, but my concern about that is because of the silencing that adopted people experience, and also our discomfort with, many of us were loved, loved in our families. It's very uncomfortable to then sit alongside and claim that we might be survivors of state care abuse when we know that there are others who have suffered horrific experiences in state care. So I think, how we're doing this is a little bit fraught as well. We know from the Australian experience that when you're trying to lump everyone together, sort of as in the stolen generations, adopted people, our experiences are more complex or maybe a bit more nuanced. From the outside, they look, it looks like a much better arrangement. And that means that experience is contested. So I would like our decision makers and the people in control of the Royal Commission and also the adoption law reform to take heed of that. We have different needs. Online? Yep.
It's that one?
From Abby. Powerful kōrero e hoa and the pātau you propose, what are we willing to tolerate? Mihi. So there's just a lot of mihi here, and we have lots and lots of mihi.
Yes. And yes, people are saying people online struggling to hear the questions, which are a result of not being able to hand around the microphone. So Abby's question, what are we willing to tolerate? So,
And I have a question really around, picking up on what you've just been talking about too. For those of us all heading home tonight as well, I think, what are some of the things that we can do to ensure that we're saying the right things in the right way to the right people, particularly knowing there's a law reform happening now. So what are some of those things that we can do?
Yeah, so the first stage of the adoption law reform consultation has occurred, and so there's analysis of those submissions underway or completed, and that's informing a second stage of consultation, which is yet to happen. And I guess I would hope that people, again, we find out the mechanisms that we can speak up, make our voices heard. And I think this is really difficult, as I said, for adopted people. We don't want to offend our adoptive families. We love them. But, there are some issues with how this was done, as I've tried to show this evening. But yeah, Ministry of Justice website, you could get on there and have a look, and that will provide you with some information about how to be heard in round 2. Yes. Yeah.
But it wasn't in particular, it wasn't until I actually talked about his puppy
Okay.
that he could then acknowledge his Māori side as well, so that he was comfortable with the job.
Right.
I just wonder, we need to consider that going forward too. That it's not just
Yeah. So, sorry, just for the people online, so the question that's come in has just said, what about instances where adopted people might initially reject attempts to support their Māoritanga, and is there another way of maybe supporting them in what being Pākehā means as well. Yeah, I mean, I think this is just stuff that we probably need to do a lot more work on, and I think part of that comes from listening to maybe adoptive parents too about what their experiences have been. As I said, there's some really cool research overseas that is looking at that. And I know that the adoption service does actually, support potential or prospective adopters with thinking through these issues. I guess I've said to them, I'd like you to talk about race consciousness with people. I think that we can't just keep calling it cultural identity or cultural consciousness. But I agree with you. I think, I'd be interested to hear more about how supporting his Pākehātanga also supported him. And look, there are many stories that we don't have, the people that don't want to reconnect. We don't necessarily know why that is. But I think what I've presented shows how difficult it is to stand up. It's frightening. People talked about, I felt very naked, exposed, without any whakapapa, even surrounded by well-meaning, supportive people. So to me that says we've all got to be better at having conversations about this, and just being, part of the course. People are comfortable. It's not something abnormal that we need to talk about. Yeah. Talk race, do race, It's not a bad thing.
No, and we often talk about this in the space of supporting people in the bicultural aspects of the mahi that we do at the university around being uncomfortable to get comfortable. Sometimes having the conversation and just starting that conversation. And I know in my own whānau, adoption it's in many of our whānau, and it looks different and it feels different, but you need to talk about it. And as someone I have an adopted brother, never met him, don't know him, and my mum has had a massive journey from Whangai to adoption, and I know that it's the silence, it's the black holes and the spaces in the wairua and all those things that need to be filled up by us. And I think that's the role, that's what I take from a lot of the mahi that Annabel has led in this space for me, is about fill up those gaps, fill up the space with conversation, because it's healthy and it needs to be spoken about. Yeah.
And I do want to say, I myself am not outright opposed to adoption. I actually think we need to talk more about what form that might take. I'm quite open to the idea that in some form it might still exist. I'm certainly not opposed to non-Māori adopting Māori children, but I think what is critical there really needs to be talked through more, So, more conversations, more mahi,
He kōrero anō, he pātai anō. Another question? Oh, you've got one on there. This is fun.
I know, right?
This is so much fun.
Oh, it's disappearing.
Okay. So the question is around how to uphold the mana of the tamaiti, the mana of the child in the conversation. What is the role of the hapu and other whānau in this, as opposed to biological parents only? Really good question. Tēnā koe, Sarah Ann.
Sarah, you've asked a hard question.
Or whakaaro.
Yeah. I suppose that's the other thing. I mean, I'm an adult, I can speak for myself now, but it has taken me 40 odd years and probably the PhD to really talk about this stuff. I don't know. I think there are people more expert in this area of sort of working with children in that immediate period. But I think that's a key thing, is often it's adults talking. It's not the child. So, but I think, some of my participants have talked about how difficult it was as children to express, to articulate their feelings around being adopted. So I think my feeling is, and my response to, being involved in forum around surrogacy, and kind of parents have these ideas about how they're going to do things, how things are going to be. And I feel that because of the diversity of adopted people, we all end up in very different positions or have a different positionality with respect to being adopted, that you just can't know. You cannot know before that baby's born, before that baby comes into your family, what that baby as a child, as an adolescent, as an adult is actually going to need. So my feeling is we need to be less prescriptive, and we actually, we need to be, I don't know, creating those mechanisms where we can hear, we can create things around those adopted people, or, you know, donor conceived people, rather than deciding as adults what we think is tika.
Maybe we'll take one more if there's a question. Kia ora.
Still the question about the identity. In some kindergarten, they are promoting the Māori disposition for the children. But when being asked what kind of disposition is unique for Māori, they couldn't answer. So my question is that,
Got the answer.
would this way of thinking actually provide the foundation for
Kyle.
Because you want to say that some ethnicities have some unique needs of disposition, other ethnicities that's not you know they have.
Okay, so to summarise...
It's a treaty conversation.
it is a treaty. So the question is what Annabel talking about, does it actually feed racism in a sense? Is that your question?
Yeah.
Promoting Māori disposition or
Yeah.
Asian
Yeah.
disposition.
Yeah, so is it divisive?
Yeah.
Yeah, is it divisive?
Okay. So, look, there's some really, really awesome work going on in Taranaki, actually. Thinking about kind of, so for our generation who are having babies, children, how do we raise our children in the way that, you know, we want them to live, be according to our values? They're calling it kaupapa Māori, or sort of early childhood programming. And so they have identified some of the kind of key attributes that we value in Te Ao Māori that we want to instill in our children. I think that's really cool because it's a positive way of looking at children. It's instilling positive values. And you could actually argue that they go across. So all children, they're attributes that would be valuable almost universally. So I don't see that as an issue. I think your question might also be about why are we privileging Māori, you know, focus on Māori? And that is definitely a treaty conversation, and the fact that, you know, Māori are tangata whenua, treaty partner. I don't think that's a problem. I think that we get that right, then we can do right by others.
And if I can add on, because that's what I do around here, if I can add on to that, I mean, in my opinion too, and Annabelle's already said this, you know, it isn't just saying outright what works for Māori works for all. I think
True.
We have the intergenerational, scientifically proven connection to that as Māori. As Māori, the way that we do things is universal. And I live and breathe that. I'm a walking, talking example of that. Many people probably in the room who've been raised in a way equally as proud of their whakapapa Māori as they are as their whakapapa Pākehā. And I can see the goodness in it, and I've felt it. And I promote that actually just in everything that I do. And I know that there's many champions for that in here, both Māori and Pākehā, who have embraced our ways of being, knowing and doing. For the greater good, and I've seen the good that has come from that. And I think what it does do is actually heals. There's a healing power, particularly around race relations, that once things are understood and better understood, and you've got to get through the uncomfortable conversations to get to the comfortability of what that solution looks and feels like. But once you're through that, you have an alignment of values. They're very humanistic. They might be Māori words and Māori things, but in my opinion, they're very human-centred. Yeah. And they're about relationships, and they're relational, and they can move and shift, and they don't look like any one thing. That's what I can tell you. So, you know, as an example of that, who lives and breathes it, and feels very comfortable in both worlds, whatever that world is, actually, and other people's.
Yeah.
Push myself into other people's worlds as well, in the Indigenous connection way. But actually, I see that nothing but the great value
Yes.
that can bring.
Yeah.
I am going to call it to a close, but before I do, I just want to, e rere atu taku mihi aroha kia koe, I know I said fangirling at the beginning, and I know others mentioned it, I heard them speaking around me, but it really is, it's more than that. I think what you are doing and what you have done, not just for yourself and your own whānau and tamariki, but for all of us, is actually, it's changing. It's changing the narrative of what this is and has been for many people. I also take on board what you said around the adoptive parents and, from that spirit of aroha too. There's a lot of things that have happened in our country that have impacted not just law, but choices and decisions. And I think we need to have aroha for our people. One of the things that I was thinking about as you were talking, and we do have a little waiata sorted around, you said you were talking about te akina te tamaiti, but you used that word atawhaingia. Atawhaingia te pāharakeke is the first thing that came to mind. It's about looking after and nurturing and caring for the whole plant. If you think of a harakeke plant, a flax plant, you have the rito in the middle, which is symbolic of the child. And then you have the awhirito, the leaves that sit around that inner very precious part of the plant. And its role, the awhirito, its role is to support, nurture and protect and care for the tamaiti, te akina te tamaiti, to look after the child. And then when you think about the plant as a whole, because obviously you've got all of these plants going off, they have an amazing root system too, intertwined, really hard to disconnect. And I think that's the place that we need to get to. We need to get to that through conversation, through aroha of understanding about our history in this country and our connection to that and that to our future. So he mihi nui ki a koe I te tuakana. Waihoki kia koutou I tai mai. Kia koutou I tai a tinana, kia koutou o Kāti Honoka, a ipurangi me ki, to those of you who've come in person, but also to those of you who have joined us tonight. This waiata really is about the pāharakeke and the importance of all of us tonight. We've just formed a new part of the plant tonight here and being enriched with the kōrero of Annabel. After that, I'll finish with a quick karakia at the end as well. Hutia te rito, hutia te rito te harakeke, kei hea te koma koe ko, ki mai ki au, he aha te mea nui, he aha te mea nui o te ao, maku e ki atu. He tangata, he tangata, he tangata, he. Unuhia, te pau, kia wātea, ai, kua wātea, tātou katoa, tēnā tātou.
Kia ora.
Ka pai.
Excellent.